At 11 p.m., I received a message from my boss. "You're fired. You're useless. I see no reason to keep you in our company." This was despite the fact that I had returned from work only an hour earlier. I always arrived early and left late. To be honest, it hurt me. But I knew exactly how it would end for the company, since more than half of the investors had been brought in by me. Now, let me explain everything step by step. I used to believe that if you came early enough, the world would be quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. That was why I always arrived at the office long before sunrise, before the sidewalks filled with hurried footsteps, and before the city remembered it had somewhere to be. But on that particular morning, as I pushed open the glass door and stepped into the dark reception area, it wasn't peace that welcomed me. It was that familiar, hollow feeling that I existed here only as a faint outline. The lights were still off. The air felt cold, as if the whole building had slept without dreaming. In the silence, my footsteps echoed too loudly, reminding me how empty the place felt without the daily buzz of voices that never included mine. I flicked on the hallway lights and made my way to the kitchenette. The coffee machine blinked, still warming up. For years I'd been the one to wake it, my unofficial job, though no one had ever asked. Or thanked me. I set my bag down, rolled up my sleeves, and began the routine that had become muscle memory. Sort today's meeting documents, print the schedules, prepare the weekly summaries, check investor emails, update the project calendar, and make sure the boardroom didn't look like a tornado had passed through it. By the time the first emails were answered and the last binder placed neatly on the table, the sun still hadn't risen. I'd been awake for hours already. Sometimes I wondered if the building noticed me more than the people inside it did. At least the building didn't pretend I wasn't there. At 7:30 sharp, the door swung open and the first wave of my colleagues stepped in. The warmth of chatter flooded the office like someone had quickly turned life back on. Coats rustled, heels clicked, someone laughed at something trivial, yet none of it touched me. One of the analysts, Jack, slowed as he passed my desk. His eyebrows rose. "Already here? As always," he said, like it was surprising but also not surprising at all. I forced a polite smile. "Morning." But he was already walking away, not waiting for a response. A few others echoed the same line as they passed, each of them wearing the same mildly amused expression, like they were all sharing some private joke. And maybe they were. I wasn't meant to hear the nickname. They never said it to my face. But office walls are thin and whispers travel far in an open floor plan. Office furniture. That was what they called me. I wasn't sure who'd started it. I wasn't even sure they remembered I was a person when they said it. Not a desk, not a chair, not some fixture that appeared here before they did and stayed long after they left. Furniture doesn't speak. Furniture doesn't complain. Furniture does its job, silently. Some days, I wished I could forget I existed the way they did. By 8:30, the office had come fully alive. But the strange thing about being invisible is that even in a crowded room, silence follows you like a shadow. No one asked how my weekend was. No one asked if I wanted coffee. No one asked, period. I was the keeper of the schedules, the inbox guardian, the person who quietly made problems disappear before anyone noticed they existed. I sometimes wondered if anyone here noticed anything about me. My dark hair always tied back, the quiet blouses I wore, the small silver pendant at my neck. Details that made up my existence. Details that people with names paid attention to. But to them, I was the one who turned on the lights. The one who placed their meeting notes in tidy stacks. The one who answered their emails before they even woke up. The one who, somehow, never mattered. I walked to the window and looked out at the unfolding city. Cars began crowding the street, headlights flickering like restless thoughts. Another long day waited, another day of carrying the weight of things no one else wanted to carry. Sometimes, before the office completely filled, I allowed myself 5 seconds, exactly 5, where I let the thought slip through. Maybe today will be different. Maybe they'll notice. Maybe they'll see. But then the elevator dinged and my boss stepped out, straightening his tie, already shouting instructions into his phone. He didn't look at me. He didn't say good morning. He didn't even slow down as he passed. The seconds vanished. Reality returned. And so I took my seat, opened my laptop, and prepared for another day of being the invisible one. Another day where everything I touched mattered. Yet somehow, I didn't. By the second week of September, I had stopped pretending that small kindnesses would ever find their way to me. The office taught me that lesson gently at first. Mild forgetfulness, overlooked invitations, harmless jokes. But lately the cruelty had sharpened, refined itself into something precise and intentional. Something that felt less like workplace teasing and more like a daily ritual built around keeping me small. That morning, I walked into the kitchenette with my mug in hand, already tasting the comfort of my one remaining stash of coffee. I had labeled it clearly, "Do not touch." Emily. I didn't think the note was aggressive. I didn't even think it was unreasonable. Everyone knew I worked late nights. Everyone saw how often I stayed long after they had clocked out. Having one small corner of the cupboard that belonged to me felt like the bare minimum of a courtesy. But as I opened the cabinet, the empty space nearly knocked the breath out of me. The jar I'd left there yesterday, my last jar, was gone. Not moved, not misplaced, gone. I stared at the vacant shelf for a long moment, feeling that familiar tightness behind my ribs. Footsteps shuffled behind me, and I turned to see Megan and Tom standing together, smirking like they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Oh no," Megan said, widening her eyes in mock concern. "Looking for your sacred coffee again?" Tom snorted. "Relax, Emily. You don't need caffeine to sit around and do nothing all day." I inhaled sharply, but words refused to form. Instead, I felt something inside me fold a little smaller, like paper creased for the 100th time. The kind of fold that eventually tears. They brushed past me to the counter, poured themselves fresh cups, and continued talking as if I'd never been there at all. Back at my desk, I tried to shake off their laughter as I printed the monthly reports. The machine hummed softly, the paper warming under my fingers as each page slid out. By the time the last bundle came through, I had almost calmed myself enough to pretend the coffee incident didn't matter. But when I returned to my workstation, the stack of printed reports was sitting on my chair, crumpled, torn, and mottled with fingerprints. Some pages were folded, others bent nearly in half, as if someone had deliberately tried to wrinkle every sheet. A small note rested on top. "Oops." That was it. Just that. A single word, written in large, loopy handwriting, the kind someone uses when they want to appear innocent while twisting the knife. I gathered the ruined pages, trying not to let my hands shake. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe someone bumped into the printer. Maybe. But the office didn't grant me the comfort of denial. A burst of poorly suppressed laughter came from the row of desks behind me. I heard the whisper, "She'll just print it again. That's her whole personality." I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in through my nose, out through my mouth, counting to 4 the way the therapist I stopped seeing years ago had taught me. I didn't need to cry. Not here, not in front of them. I reprinted all 50 pages, By the time I finished organizing them into a presentation binder, sunlight had fully claimed the room, pouring through the windows in warm stripes that touched every desk except mine. I carried the binder to the meeting room where Mark, my manager, was already seated. He didn't greet me. He didn't even look up as I placed the presentation in front of him. He flipped through the pages lazily, as though he were browsing a menu he had no intention of ordering from. After less than 2 minutes, he snapped the binder shut. "No design," he said bluntly. "Weak. Redo it." I swallowed. "But the data is fine," he cut in. "But visually, useless. Redo it." I nodded. Fighting back would be pointless. He'd already decided how the conversation would go, and he would use those exact same pages. I knew he would. He always did. He dismissed my work like it was scrap metal, but polished it like gold when presenting it to others. Later that afternoon, as I waited outside the conference room with the updated binder in hand, I overheard him speaking to the executive team. "You'll see my approach in the new deck," he said confidently. "I built the flow myself, kept the data tight, tightened the projections." My jaw clenched. Word for word, it was my work he was referring to, my flow, my projections, my structure, my silence, always my silence. Sometimes I wondered which part of me they disliked more, my presence or my inability to fight back. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that I stayed quiet because I couldn't risk losing this job, because the world outside this glass building was far more uncertain than the cruelty inside it. They didn't know how tightly I clung to stability, no matter how badly it burned. By evening, the office began to empty out. The lights dimmed one by one as people grabbed their bags, chatting about dinner plans or happy hour drinks. I sat alone at my desk, surrounded by the faint hum of electronics, wondering if maybe I really was invisible to them. Invisible until they needed something. Invisible until something went wrong. Invisible until there was blame to place. Invisibility came with a strange kind of powerlessness. You couldn't defend yourself against what people refused to admit they were doing. As I gathered my files for the next morning, I felt the broken pieces of me shifting, rearranging themselves in ways I couldn't quite understand yet. Every day chipped away at something. Every day left a mark. Every day made me wonder how long a person could endure this kind of erosion before something finally snapped. What I didn't know then was that the snap was coming, soon, and in a form I never could have predicted. There is a particular kind of quiet that forms in a meeting room right before the truth is rewritten. I had sat through enough presentations to recognize it, the slight shuffle of papers, the artificial clearing of throats, the polite nodding before the show begins. But on that day, as I entered the boardroom with my notebook pressed to my chest, the silence felt heavier than usual, as though it already knew what was about to happen to me. My chair was in the corner, as always. Not at the table, not near the screen, but tucked into the shadowy part of the room like a forgotten suitcase. I took my place without protest. I had learned long ago that my value existed only behind the scenes, not beside the people who took credit for what I built. The major investor, a man with a firm handshake and a polite smile, sat near the head of the table. I had been the one to persuade him to visit, the one who spent weeks building rapport, answering late-night emails, and preparing every document he requested. This deal could stabilize 3 departments. It could reshape the entire quarter. But no one here knew the hours I had poured into it. No one cared to ask. Mark walked in, shoulders squared, voice warmed with a confidence he hadn't earned. "Thank you all for coming," he said, clasping his hands together. "I personally handled the negotiations with our valued investor here." My heart sank, not in surprise, but in recognition. I had expected this. Maybe I even prepared myself for it. But knowing a blow is coming doesn't soften it. It just teaches you how to brace. The investor glanced at me briefly, as if he wanted to acknowledge something, but Mark's voice cut the moment apart with practiced ease. He launched into the deck I had made, and presented my talking points verbatim, moving his hands in the same gestures I had outlined in my notes. He spoke about strategy, projections, risk management, all summaries I had crafted through endless nights spent at my kitchen table. Every slide, every phrase, every detail bore my fingerprints. But here, in this room, those fingerprints had been scrubbed clean. I sat motionless, staring at the table's polished surface, watching his reflection move as he claimed piece after piece of me. When the executives nodded in approval, I felt my throat tighten. When they commended his leadership, the ache grew deeper. I had grown so used to silence that it wrapped around me like a blanket, holding me down when I wanted to rise and speak. But I couldn't. Not because I lacked the courage, but because the cost of breaking the silence felt too high. I needed this job. I needed the paycheck. I needed stability more than I needed recognition. At least that's what I kept telling myself. "Brilliant work, Mark," one of the directors said. "Your approach is clean and compelling," another added. Mark accepted the praise as if accepting a reward he felt entitled to. "Thank you. I've always prioritized clarity." I looked down at my lap. My hands were clasped so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The investor shifted again, his eyes sliding toward me, almost apologetic, but even he didn't speak up. After the meeting, people filtered out in clusters, discussing the potential deal. No one looked my way. No one acknowledged that I had been in the room at all. When the door finally shut and only I remained, I felt my shoulders collapse inward. The strength I'd used to stay upright dissolved. I leaned forward and rested my forehead against the cool wood of the table. Not to cry, just to breathe. The ache wasn't sharp anymore. It pulsed slowly, like a bruise forming under the skin. Sometimes I imagined what it would feel like to be seen. Not praised, not applauded, just seen. To have someone say, "Emily did this," or "Emily solved that." To have a single sentence in the room that acknowledged my existence. But that kind of validation felt like a luxury item in this place, something reserved for people with louder personalities, bigger egos, or simply better luck. I gathered my things and returned to my desk. On my way, I caught fragments of whispers, little comments that floated across the room as though carried by drafts of cold air. "She's just admin support, not leadership material. She doesn't really contribute. Mark runs the team. Quiet ones never go far." The words were soft but sharp. They found the cracks in me with expert precision, slipping inside like needles. I kept walking. I couldn't afford to let them see the wound. Back at my desk, my inbox had already filled with new requests. Investor follow-ups, revised documents, schedules to rebuild. The weight settled onto my shoulders again, familiar and suffocating. I began typing, hands steady despite everything twisting inside me. Every email I sent, every report I completed, every problem I solved silently added another layer to the unseen foundation of this company, the foundation that was somehow mine to hold alone. The burden was immense. The silence was suffocating. But the truth was simple. I needed the job, and because of that, I carried the weight without complaint, without recognition, without reward. What none of them realized, and what even I didn't fully understand yet, was that every load they placed on me, every slight they dismissed as harmless, Every task they assumed I would silently shoulder was slowly forging something unbreakable inside me. Pressure doesn't only crush. Sometimes it creates. And soon, the very silence they forced upon me would be the thing that swallowed them whole. There's a certain kind of loneliness that settles over an empty office after everyone else has gone home. It hangs in the air like leftover perfume, quiet and faintly bitter. By the time the clock blinked 10:47 p.m., the entire floor had gone still. Even the ventilation hum had thinned into a soft, hollow whisper. Most people would have felt uneasy being here alone, but for me, the solitude was a relief, a softness I wasn't afforded during the day. My lamp cast a small circle of light across my desk, illuminating scattered documents, half-written notes, and the glow of my laptop screen. I had been working on a report the board needed by morning, a report that technically wasn't part of my job description, but had somehow become my responsibility anyway. Like everything else, like always. The company's deadlines didn't sleep, and neither did I. I rubbed my eyes, stretching my neck as I took a slow breath. The numbers blurred for a moment before settling into focus again. I had been typing nonstop for hours. The office carried the faint scent of stale coffee and paper ink, and it clung to my clothes like a reminder that I lived more in this building than in my own apartment. Outside the window, the city lights blinked softly in the dark. Cars drifted by far below, their headlights catching puddles left from an earlier rain. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, rising and fading like a warning I was too exhausted to interpret. My phone buzzed once, a sharp vibration against the desk that startled me in the silence. 11:02 p.m. I frowned. No one messaged me at this hour. No one messaged me at all, really, unless it was a forwarded task or an accidental group text. I reached for the phone, expecting another reminder from the system, or maybe a late request from a colleague who'd forgotten I had a life outside these walls. But when I unlocked the screen, a single notification sat there, stark and cold. From unknown number. You don't do anything. You're fired. Don't come in tomorrow. My breath caught. For a second, I thought it might be a prank. Something dumb and cruel, like the coffee jokes or the torn reports. But no. The tone was too deliberate, too cutting, too final. My hands started to tremble. I reread the message once, twice, a third time. Each repetition carved the words deeper into me. You don't do anything. The irony burned so deeply it made my heart feel hollow. I had spent 15 years, building this company from underneath, making sure nothing collapsed while the people above me took bows they hadn't earned. I had sacrificed weekends, birthdays, relationships, sleep. I had poured myself into responsibilities that had never been mine to carry. I had been the first one in, the last one out. The silent engine humming behind all the noise. And now this? I looked around the room, half expecting someone to jump out and laugh, to say it was all some elaborate joke. But the office was still and cold and indifferent. Only the reflection of my own stunned expression stared back from the darkened window. I swallowed hard, the motion painful. My throat felt tight, like my body didn't know how to breathe anymore. After 15 years, this was how they let me go? A midnight text? From an unknown number? Slow fury mixed with a deeper, heavier grief. Not because the job defined me, but because I had let it. I had convinced myself that I was needed, that my efforts mattered, that loyalty meant something in a world that had proven time and time again it didn't. I stood slowly, each movement feeling foreign. I looked at my desk, my carefully organized folders, the neat stacks of papers, the small ceramic mug I kept at the corner. 2 belongings. That was all I had here, really. Things I could carry in one hand. Everything else I had given the company wasn't tangible. It couldn't be packed. Years of work, effort, exhaustion, none of it had weight they could measure. I placed my notebook into my bag, then hesitated before picking up my mug. A simple white cup, chipped on one side. The only thing in this place that had ever felt like mine. The hum of the building seemed louder as I walked through the empty walkway, flipping off lights as I went. My footsteps echoed, too loud, as if the floors themselves were asking why I was leaving so quietly. But I couldn't make noise. Not tonight. When I reached the front door, I paused, hand resting on the cold metal bar. A strange stillness washed over me. A realization that this was the first time in 15 years I was leaving without worrying about tomorrow's workload. And yet, the freedom felt nothing like relief. It felt like standing in the eye of a storm, unaware of how enormous the destruction around me already was. I pushed the door open and stepped into the night. The air hit me like a sudden gust of reality, cool, sharp, almost cleansing. I took one last look at the building, its glass panels reflecting the city lights like 100 indifferent eyes. No one was inside calling after me. No one wondered where I went. No one knew I had just walked out for the last time. 15 years of loyalty traded for a single message. You don't do anything. If only they knew how wrong they were. If only they knew what losing me would truly cost them. Soon they would, but for now, I walked away, silent, trembling, and carrying nothing except a chipped mug, a notebook, and 15 years' worth of unspoken truth. It took 3 days for the first cracks to appear, hairline fractures spreading quietly beneath the surface of the company like stress lines in aging concrete. I wasn't there to witness the early signs, but the messages, rumors, and frantic calls that began trickling into my personal inbox told me enough. The building I had held together for years was finally learning what life looked like without the invisible hands that had kept it standing. On Monday morning, long before anyone realized I was gone for good, the investors started calling the office. At first, the calls were routed to reception, where the secretary, Polly, a sweet girl with a habit of twirling her hair when nervous, stumbled through vague explanations about some internal changes. Investors didn't like vague. They liked structure. They liked certainty. They liked me. By noon, the panic had already begun. I imagined the scene. The way Polly's voice would tighten, the shuffling of papers on her desk, her frantic attempts to contact someone who knew what to say, but no one did. Because for 15 years, I had been the one to explain delays, negotiate new deadlines, calm fears, soothe egos, and devise solutions before problems were officially problems. Without me, the hallway leading to the executive offices must have felt like a storm gathering speed. On Tuesday, they tried searching through my old folders, but my organization system wasn't stored on any shared drive. It lived entirely in my mind, carefully structured yet fully invisible to anyone who had never bothered to ask how things worked. I had offered once, long ago, to standardize my system so the team could follow it. The response had been sharp and dismissive. Don't impose your way on everyone else, Emily. So I didn't. I adapted to them. And now they were drowning in the sea I had once kept calm. By midweek, departments began turning on each other. Accusations whispered down hallways. People scrambled to find information that had always flowed effortlessly through me. Every report depended on another report that depended on another conversation that depended on an email I had answered months ago. I could almost hear their frustration echoing through the walls I no longer walked past. Why is the investor timeline missing? Who handled the last quarterly projections? Who talked to the partners about the expansion? Where is the communication log? Where is anything? My absence was no longer a quiet gap. It was a gaping hole. Every morning that week, I woke with the strange sensation of weightlessness, as if a part of me expected to rush into the office, to fix everything, to pull the strings back into place. But then I remembered the message, the dismissal, the coldness, and that odd, painful emptiness returned. I didn't miss the building, I didn't miss the people, but I missed the purpose I'd built there, the sense that I kept things moving, that I mattered even if no one admitted it. I missed the rhythm of solving problems before they fully formed. I missed being the silent architect of stability, but the company's chaos didn't stop there. On Thursday, an investor sent a message to my personal email, one I had provided him years ago because the company line was unreliable. His tone was polite but firm. Emily, I attempted to reach you through your office, but I was informed you are no longer with the company. Is that correct? We need clarity on the development timeline. Please advise. I stared at the screen, uncertain whether to respond. I hadn't told anyone the truth about my firing. Part of me felt embarrassed, as if their cruel departure defined my worth. But another part of me, quieter, deeper, steadier, knew I didn't owe the company anything. I replied simply, "Yes, I am no longer employed there. I recommend contacting the executive team for updates." His response came in less than 3 minutes. "That's disappointing. You were the only person with complete oversight." I closed my laptop and exhaled slowly. By Friday morning, my former coworkers were in full crisis mode. Messages flooded my personal phone, unknown numbers, frantic tones, people who had barely noticed me when I sat 3 feet away from them. Do you remember where the investor portfolio was saved? How did you organize the quarterly reports? Do you know the status of the partnership renewal? Can you tell us where you kept the communication logs? Please, Emily, we're falling behind. I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. These were the same voices that had mocked me, ignored me, belittled me. They had torn my reports, stolen my coffee, laughed at the effort I put into the work that now sustained them. They had never once thanked me for anything. Now they were scrambling through the pieces of a system they had refused to understand. The collapse was beginning, not loud or explosive, but slow and relentless, like a leak in a dam that no one bothered to repair until the water began seeping through the cracks. The irony almost felt poetic. That weekend, for the first time in years, I let myself breathe. I woke without an alarm. I opened my windows and let the afternoon sun spill across my living room. I made coffee, my own coffee, untouched by anyone else, and took my time drinking it. I went for a long walk. I listened to music I used to love before work consumed my life. But beneath the peace, an uneasy thought lingered. They still didn't understand. They didn't know yet how deeply the company depended on me, how many threads I held together, how many fires I extinguished before they ever started. But they would. By Monday morning, a reckoning waited for them, one they had unknowingly created with their own hands. When Monday arrived, the company expected business as usual. Investors would sign. Deals would stabilize. The quarter would proceed as though nothing had changed. But reality doesn't bend for wishful thinking, and by 9:13 a.m., the first true shock hit the executive floor. A major partner, one whose portfolio alone supported nearly 20% of the company's revenue, sent a blunt, unmistakably final email to the board. We worked with Emily, not your administrative intermediaries. The manner in which she was dismissed demonstrates a lack of respect and stability. We are terminating our involvement effective immediately. I didn't see the message myself, but later I would hear from 3 different sources how quickly the room dissolved into panic. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Someone cursed loudly. Another person demanded to know why they hadn't been informed of the circumstances. No one admitted they didn't even know the circumstances, because the truth was simple. They hadn't bothered to look. By 10 a.m., the second investor pulled out. By lunchtime, 3 more followed. The dominoes fell with predictable precision, each one triggered by the same realization. The person they trusted, the person they had chosen to work with, was gone. And not just gone, thrown away. Dismissed through a midnight text that investors interpreted as recklessness, instability, and a sign of deeper mismanagement. Investors didn't like chaos. They didn't tolerate disrespect. And they certainly didn't want their money tied to a company that treated the core of its operations like disposable scrap. I imagined the faces of my former colleagues, eyes growing wider, skin paling as they scrolled through the flood of withdrawal notices. Those who had once mocked me were suddenly calculating how much of their job relied on the very systems I had created. Systems now unraveling, thread by thread. The CFO reportedly slammed his fist on the table. Who the hell was handling communication with these accounts? Emily, came the answer. Quiet. Guilty. Small. The name must have echoed in that room like a ghost. Not admin support, not office furniture, not background noise. Emily. The realization hit them slowly at first, then violently all at once. My inbox logs, my spreadsheets, my tracking systems, my investor notes written in shorthand only I understood, the reconciliations I handled, the projections I maintained, the timelines I protected, all gone. No one knew the status of pending contracts. No one had the signed copies of the renewal agreements. No one had been in the calls I had taken alone because no one else wanted to stay past 6 p.m. At 2:40 p.m., the board ordered an internal audit, something they had avoided for years because everything runs itself. But the problem with things that run themselves is that sometimes someone is doing the running and the rest of the world just doesn't see it. The audit team dug for hours. By sunset, the truth was undeniable. 80% of the company's investment communication had been handled by me alone. 80% of the follow-up coordination, the risk mitigation, the negotiation preparation, me. 3 departments had relied on my late-night work to keep them afloat. Projects that appeared seamless on the outside had been held together with quiet patches I fixed before disaster erupted. When the auditors ran the numbers, the room reportedly went silent. Losses due to terminated investments and frozen contracts. $50 million. 50 million. A number impossible to ignore. Impossible to blame on coincidence, impossible to sweep under the rug. Someone asked, how did we not know she was doing all this? No one answered. I wondered what it felt like for them, to sit in a room that once dismissed me and finally feel the weight I had carried for over a decade. To realize that the person they'd mocked, overlooked, and underpaid had been the anchor holding the company in place. I imagined Mark, my manager, trying to explain himself, trying to minimize his role, trying to insist I had been support, nothing more. But numbers don't lie. People do. The audit report was brutal, unbiased, and impossible to argue with. It listed tasks I'd taken over without asking because no one else wanted to do them. It listed risks I had caught before they became liabilities. It listed calendar errors I prevented, regulatory issues I corrected, investor dissatisfaction I soothed, and strategic plans I drafted for executives who never even read them before presenting. My fingerprints, those same invisible fingerprints, were suddenly visible everywhere. It was almost poetic. That night, while the board panicked, while executives cursed, and while entire departments scrambled to gather missing information, I sat at home on my couch with a blanket around my shoulders. A quiet evening, soft and uneventful, stretching ahead of me. I sipped my tea, in the quiet of my own living room, and looked out the window at the streetlights flickering on. I should have felt angry. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt something loud and sharp. But what settled inside me wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. They hadn't fired someone unimportant. They had fired their foundation. And now, everything built on top of me was crumbling, just as it was always destined to. The collapse had begun. And I, for the first time in 15 years, was watching it from the outside, with no obligation to save them. The board meeting was scheduled for 8 in the morning, but by 7:30 the conference room was already full. Directors sitting stiffly around the polished table, department heads clutching tablets they didn't know how to interpret, and senior managers pale with the kind of fear that only comes when people finally understand how deeply they have failed. The silence in the room wasn't ordinary corporate tension. It was the quiet you feel right before a verdict. For the first time in 15 years, my name was on everyone's lips, though I wasn't there to hear it. The auditors, 3 of them, entered the room with heavy binders and tired eyes. They didn't sit. They didn't exchange pleasantries. They simply placed the documents on the table, and the sound echoed like a hammer striking stone. "Let's begin," the lead auditor said. No one dared to look away. The findings were presented calmly, too calmly, given the severity of what followed. In a steady voice, the auditor read through the list of responsibilities I had handled myself: investor communication, strategic planning, follow-up coordination, risk assessment, calendar management across departments, crisis mitigation, contract preparation, pre-negotiation research, and tracking metrics that no one else had even known were necessary. Emily Carter maintained the investment flow, the auditor read. She also drafted strategic plans for upper management, identified potential project failures before they occurred, and handled investor dissatisfaction personally. The room was silent. She performed work equivalent to 3 full departments. Still silent. And she did this without a title, without recognition, and without compensation proportionate to her responsibilities. The silence finally became unbearable. One of the directors pressed a hand to his forehead, whispering something under his breath. Another leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, jaw clenched as though he were physically ill. The CFO swore under his breath, fingers tapping rapidly against the table. But it wasn't the executives who reacted the strongest. It was the people who had worked beside me every day, the ones who had stolen my coffee, torn my reports, laughed at my effort, rolled their eyes when I entered a room. Now their faces were pale, as if someone had drained all the color from them. Megan, who had teased me about being office furniture, stared at her lap as though she couldn't bear to meet anyone's eyes. Tom, who used to smirk when I stayed late, was sitting rigidly in his chair, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned bone white. Even Mark, my manager, my suppressor, my thief, looked shaken. His confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a brittle, cracking facade. When the audit team displayed a slide showing the company's financial losses, $50 million, Mark's composure shattered completely. "This is absurd," he said, voice rising. "One person couldn't possibly be responsible for all of that." The lead auditor didn't flinch. "Not responsible for the losses, Mr. Whitfield. Responsible for preventing them. For years." That sentence hung in the air like a blade. Executives turned toward Mark, their expressions sharpening. For the first time, they saw him not as a leader but as a gatekeeper who had kept the wrong person in the shadows. "It appears," the auditor continued, "that Ms. Carter repeatedly attempted to expand the transparency of her systems but was discouraged." Several heads turned again. "And that her work was frequently presented by others without attribution." More heads turned. "And that she consistently stayed late, sometimes until midnight, performing tasks that were never formally assigned to her." A suffocating hush fell over the room. I wasn't there, but I imagined the embarrassment, the guilt, the rising panic, the realization that they hadn't simply overlooked me, they had depended on me entirely while pretending I didn't exist. Someone from the marketing department muttered, "Oh my God." Someone else whispered, "We did this." But most reactions weren't remorseful. They were terrified. They had built their careers on the assumption that the silent girl in the corner would never break, never falter, never disappear. And now that I was gone, everything they built was sinking like a ship with too many holes. The CEO finally spoke, voice low but shaking at the edges. "How did this happen under our watch?" The answer came quickly. "You underestimated her," said the auditor. "You dismissed her. And you assumed that because she didn't speak loudly, she wasn't carrying the weight." No one argued. For the next hour, the room replayed every failure, every misattributed report, every ignored contribution, every meeting where I sat quietly while others claimed my work. People shifted uncomfortably, unable to escape the truth. They had mocked the woman who was doing the work of an entire division. They had belittled the person who kept their investors loyal. They had fired the foundation holding them steady, and now they were sinking in the hollow space I left behind. Shame rolled through the room like a wave. Some bowed their heads. Some rubbed their faces in disbelief. Some stared blankly at the table, unable to process that their cruelty had consequences far larger than their jokes. And yet, not all of them felt guilt. Some were purely, visibly afraid of the board's judgment, afraid of losing their positions, afraid that their comfortable lives were about to fracture the way the company had. But the truth was bigger than fear. This was their awakening. The moment they finally saw me, not as a shadow, not as background noise, not as office furniture, but as the very structure they had taken for granted. In the silence that followed the final slide, the CEO cleared his throat. "We need her back," he said. The words dropped like a stone into water, but it was already too late for some of them. They had awakened to the truth, and awakening always comes with consequences. The first call came on a Wednesday morning, just after 9. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee cradled between my palms, watching sunlight spill across the floor like a quiet apology for all the darkness I'd endured. My phone buzzed once, an unfamiliar number. I considered ignoring it. The peace of these mornings had become precious, something I didn't want interrupted. But curiosity pushed my thumb across the screen. "Hello?" A too cheerful voice burst through the speaker. "Emily, hi, this is Sandra from HR. How are you?" I blinked. Her tone was strange, light, syrupy, almost cloying. It didn't match the memory I had of her short, clipped emails or her dismissive glances when we passed in the hallway. I'm fine, I said cautiously. Can I help you? Oh, we were just hoping to reconnect. She laughed nervously, the sound brittle as glass. We're also sorry about the, confusion around your departure. Confusion. That was the word they chose. There was no confusion, I said quietly. I was fired. A long pause. Well, she finally managed. That's precisely why I'm calling. We'd like to discuss the possibility of you returning. Returning? As if I were a misplaced item they suddenly remembered needing. I see, I murmured, though I didn't. Sandra rushed ahead, desperate to fill the silence. The board has recognized your contributions, significant contributions, truly essential ones, and we think that your return could help stabilize. Is this about the investors? I asked sharply. Her breath hitched. I'm not at liberty to discuss details, but it is then. Another silence, a guilty one. We'd like to schedule a meeting, she said, voice strained now. The sooner the better. I'll think about it. Oh, wonderful. We'll be in touch again. I hung up before she finished. My heart thudded steady and slow, not with fear, not with anger, but with an unfamiliar calm. They needed me. They knew it. And suddenly, I wasn't the desperate one anymore. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number I recognized. The CEO. I let it ring twice before I answered. Emily, he said, voice low and formal. Thank you for picking up. I didn't respond. Let him feel the silence for once. I'll get straight to the point, he continued. We want you back. The board wants you back. We're prepared to discuss new terms. New terms? I repeated. You mean employment conditions that should have existed years ago? He exhaled sharply. Emily, we miscalculated. Miscalculated. The arrogance of the word nearly made me laugh. You fired me over a text message, I said, at 11 at night, without warning, without justification. That was premature, he admitted, and deeply regrettable. Regrettable. Only now, when the company was collapsing, did regret exist. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of my coffee seep into my hands. For the first time in 15 years, I was in control. The power didn't feel explosive or triumphant. It felt steady, solid, like something that had always been mine but had been buried under years of silence. What exactly are you offering? I asked. I'd prefer to discuss that in person, he replied quickly, but I want to assure you things will be different. You'll have authority, real authority, and recognition. Authority, recognition. Words I had never been granted when I needed them. I let several seconds stretch out before answering. I'll consider it, I finally said. He exhaled as if someone had just loosened the rope around his neck. Thank you. Truly. I hung up again, this time feeling no guilt, no hesitation, no fear. Their desperation didn't empower me out of vengeance. It empowered me because, for the first time, I understood my worth outside of their warped hierarchy. I had spent years believing I needed them to validate my work, to justify my exhaustion, to give meaning to the long nights I sacrificed. But they had been the ones depending on me all along. And without me, they were falling apart. I sat quietly, sipping my coffee as the city hummed beyond my window. A gentle breeze moved through the curtains, carrying with it a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. If I returned, I wouldn't be the same Emily. Not the quiet one, not the shadow, not the invisible backbone they thought they could discard. Before, I stayed because I needed them. Now, the balance had shifted. They needed me. That night, as I lay in bed, their calls replayed in my mind, not with bitterness, but with a strange, fierce clarity. They had awakened to their mistakes, but their newfound humility didn't erase the years of cruelty. It didn't erase the lonely mornings, the torn reports, the stolen coffee, or the countless days where I had been treated like nothing more than moving background noise. But power had a way of reshaping everything. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready. Whether I would return or not, I didn't yet know. But one thing was certain. The next conversation, with them, with myself, would be on my terms. And for the first time in 15 years, they would have to listen. The morning I returned to the office, the sky was a muted gray, calm but heavy, like the world knew something was shifting. I chose my outfit carefully, not out of vanity but intention. A charcoal blazer, crisp white blouse, hair tied back with deliberate precision. My steps felt measured, grounded, almost ceremonial. For 15 years, I had entered this building quietly. Today, I walked through the doors like someone who finally understood her own gravity. The receptionist saw me first. Polly's eyes widened, her mouth dropping open before she scrambled to sit up straighter. "Emily! Oh, welcome back." She stumbled over the words, cheeks flushing pink. "They told us you might come in today." I offered her a small, polite nod. "Good morning, Polly." Her shoulders relaxed, slightly, but her gaze followed me the way someone watches a stranger who can decide their future with a single sentence. The elevator ride felt unusually silent. My reflection in the steel doors didn't look like the woman who used to work late nights in the corner desk no one glanced at. There was something sharper now, something untethered, something seen. When the elevator opened onto my old floor, the hum of conversation died instantly. Dozens of eyes lifted, dozens of faces stiffened. Dozens of people who once stepped around me as if I were part of the carpet now froze, like statues caught mid-sin. I walked forward anyway. The path to the conference room felt surreal. My footsteps were steady, echoing louder than they ever had. The colleagues who used to laugh behind my back suddenly avoided eye contact with near religious devotion. Megan, once proud owner of the office furniture nickname, sat rigidly at her desk, staring at her monitor so intensely she might as well have been trying to merge with it. Tom pretended to flip through a stack of papers, though his hands trembled with every page. Mark, my former manager, spotted me next. The transformation of his expression was almost cinematic. Shock, then panic, then an uneasy attempt at a smile. "Emily," he said, voice brittle. "Good to see you." I didn't break my stride. "Is it?" He swallowed, the sound audible even from 2 steps away. "We, heard the board wanted to discuss your new role." The word new came out strangled, as if it hurt to say. "I'm sure you did," I replied smoothly. If guilt could be measured, the room would have drowned in it. The CEO waited for me outside the large corner office, hands clasped, smile forcibly gentle. "Emily," he greeted, with far more warmth than he'd ever managed before. "We're glad you're here." Glad. Such a small, flimsy word for such a colossal shift. "I hope it's worth my time," I said, not cruelly, simply honestly. He let out a breath that bordered on a laugh. "Please, come with me." Inside, the board members stood as I entered. Not one of them had ever stood for me before. Not once. But today they rose as if acknowledging a visiting dignitary. I met their eyes one by one, steady, calm, unflinching. A folder lay on the table with my name embossed in silver. The CEO gestured toward it, then toward the large leather chair at the head of the table. "Please sit, Emily. This is your meeting." Your meeting. I lowered myself into the chair, and as I did, a strange sensation washed over me, like claiming something that had always been mine but had been kept out of reach. "We'd like to formally offer you a leadership position," one director said, Director of Strategic Investments. A title carved from the very work I had carried for years. You will oversee investor operations, strategy planning, and the reorganization of 3 departments, another added, with full authority and full recognition. Full recognition. The words hit deeper than they knew. Recognition wasn't applause or vanity, it was truth. It was acknowledgement that I had existed in this building long before they had noticed me. Before signing anything, I glanced toward the glass wall facing the office floor. The people beyond it weren't pretending anymore. They watched me openly, faces tight with the painful realization that the woman they dismissed as invisible now outranked every one of them. I turned back to the board. "I'll accept," I said, "on 3 conditions." The room stiffened. "1," I continued, "I choose my own team." Nods. 2, I have full authority over hiring and termination in the departments I supervise. Another rush of nods. "And 3, I said, letting the final condition settle like a stone sinking into deep water, "my work will never again be presented by someone else." Silence, then agreement. The contract was placed in front of me. The pen felt cool, solid, decisive in my hand. When I signed my name, Emily Carter, the ink dried instantly, black and permanent, like rewriting the last 15 years with a single stroke. The CEO extended his hand. "Welcome back, Director Carter." This time, I shook it without lowering my eyes. When I stepped out of the office, the whispers started immediately, but not the mocking kind. These were different. Sharp, awed, fearful. The secretary approached me with a soft, almost reverent smile. "Ms. Carter, your new office is ready. Please follow me." We walked down the hallway, past the desks, past the people who used to ignore me, until we reached a door I had never been allowed to approach before. On it shone a new metal plaque, immaculate and proud. Director of Strategic Investments, Emily Carter. The secretary opened the door for me. Sunlight flooded the room, bright, expansive, warm. A spacious desk, large windows, minimalist shelves. A real office. A place where decisions were made, not stolen. I stepped inside. For the first time in my life, the room fit me. I didn't feel like a shadow climbing the walls. I didn't feel like furniture. I didn't feel like a ghost wandering the corridors. I felt central, powerful, unavoidable. As the door closed behind me, a quiet truth settled in my chest. They didn't just bring me back. They elevated the very thing they once tried to erase. Emily Carter was no longer invisible. Emily Carter was the storm. My first week as Director of Strategic Investments felt like stepping into a new life. One that had always existed in potential, but had been buried under years of silence and self-doubt. My office, with its clean lines and wide windows, became a command center rather than a cage. Sunlight poured across the polished floor each morning, illuminating something inside me I hadn't felt in years. Steadiness. I belonged here. Not because they needed me now, but because I had earned it long before they knew my name. The board's instructions had been clear: rebuild, reorganize, and restore order. But how I chose to do that was left entirely to me. It was the first time in 15 years that the company wasn't dictating my boundaries. I had the authority now, real, tangible, undeniable authority, to shape the future of the place that once tried to erase me. I began with a team. I reviewed every department, every process, every gap that had once forced me to work late nights to keep things afloat. I called in key staff members for one-on-one meetings. Some entered my office nervously, others with forced confidence, but all of them understood the gravity of sitting across from me now. The first person I promoted was Ava from accounting, a woman who had quietly done the work of 3 colleagues without complaint. She had never belittled me, never mocked me, and though we were not close, I had always recognized an unspoken solidarity between us. She blinked rapidly when I handed her the promotion letter, emotion knotting in her throat. "You deserve this," I told her. Her voice trembled. "Thank you, Director Carter." Next came the removals. Megan, who had bullied me more openly than most, sat stiffly in the chair across from me, hands clasped so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She attempted a brittle smile. "I know we've had misunderstandings, Emily." I raised a hand. "Stop. We're not rewriting history." Her face drained of color. "You created a toxic environment," I said calmly. "You undermined my work for years. And now that I lead this division, that behavior has consequences." Her protest was weak, desperate. "I didn't think—" "You didn't," I replied. "That's the problem." Her dismissal was handled professionally, but the message carried weight. Cruelty was no longer currency here. Tom was next. Then 2 others who had contributed to the culture that kept me small. I didn't remove them out of spite. I removed them because rebuilding a stable infrastructure required trust, respect, and accountability, qualities they had never shown. With each decision, the company shifted. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. By the end of the week, I had assembled a new team, a group of capable, often overlooked employees who had been overshadowed by louder, flashier colleagues. They looked surprised to be chosen, humbled even, but they stepped into their roles with sincerity. The office atmosphere changed too. The air, once thick with gossip and casual cruelty, felt clearer. People walked more carefully, not out of fear, but awareness. Rebuilding the investor network came next. I spent hours each day calling partners personally, acknowledging the instability, offering transparency, and presenting detailed plans to regain their trust. Not excuses, not corporate scripts. Real communication, the kind I had always provided behind the scenes, but could now deliver openly. Slowly, deals began to thaw. Investors who had cut ties softened their tone. A few even expressed apology for the abrupt withdrawal, insisting their loyalty had been tied to me all along. "We trust your leadership," one said, "not the company's, yours." And for once, it didn't sting to hear that. It strengthened me. I implemented new systems, transparent, accessible, efficient. No one was allowed to hide behind confusion or laziness anymore. Processes that once existed only in my memory were documented, organized, and shared. Meetings became orderly, purposeful. Departments began to collaborate rather than compete. The company's heartbeat, erratic for weeks, steadied under a rhythm I helped rebuild. One afternoon, as I reviewed a progress report, Mark knocked lightly on my door. The sight of him startled me, not because I feared him, but because I no longer recognized any power he once held over me. "Emily," he said quietly, "do you have a moment?" I gestured for him to enter. He sat slowly, shoulders slumped, the arrogance drained from him. His voice cracked with something unfamiliar. Humility. "I came to apologize," he said, "for everything. I didn't understand what you were doing all those years." "And now?" I asked. His eyes lowered. "Now I understand how badly I failed you." I nodded once, not with cruelty, not with forgiveness, simply with truth. You didn't fail me, I said. You failed the company and yourself. He nodded, accepting it. Then he left the room quietly, like a man finally aware of his own smallness. The recovery was slow, but it was real. Each week, the numbers stabilized. Investor confidence rose. Internal communication became smoother. The board checked in frequently, this time with respect, not condescension. And through it all, I felt something unfamiliar spreading within me. I was valued. I was respected. I was visible. There were mornings before dawn when I'd sit in my office, watching the city wake through the wide glass windows. I'd remember the old days, arriving early, lights off, coffee machine humming in the dark. I'd remember how invisible I felt, how small, how quietly I had moved through those halls. Now, the halls moved around me. People greeted me with sincerity. They sought my guidance. They deferred to my judgment. Not out of fear, but trust. And each small moment stitched itself into a new identity, one I'd never allowed myself to imagine. I was no longer the shadow in the corner. I was the center of the room. On a Friday afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast amber light across my desk, I stood at my window and took in the quiet, confident pulse of the company I had reshaped. The office behind me buzzed softly, orderly, respectful, whole. This was my era, a new era, an era where I wasn't furniture, wasn't invisible, wasn't voiceless. I was Director Emily Carter. And for the first time in 15 years, I felt something simple and profound. I was finally seen.